Sophie deleted Ethan's number on a cold Sunday evening, sitting alone beside her bedroom window while rain quietly covered the glass. She stared at his name on her phone for almost 5 minutes before finally pressing delete contact. Her finger trembled, but she didn't stop. A few seconds later, his name disappeared from her contacts. Sophie looked at the empty screen and whispered, "It's over." She wanted to believe those words. She needed to believe them. But what she didn't know was that deleting someone's number was easy. Forgetting everything they had shared was a completely different thing. 3 years earlier, Sophie and Ethan had met at a small coffee shop near their university. Sophie had been sitting alone, trying to finish an assignment, when Ethan accidentally knocked her coffee onto the table. He immediately apologized and offered to buy her another one. Sophie was annoyed at first, but his nervous smile made her laugh. What started as an awkward meeting slowly became a friendship, and that friendship eventually turned into love. They began spending almost every day together. They had their favorite table at the coffee shop, a park where they often walked after sunset, and a little bookstore where Ethan would pretend to understand Sophie's complicated taste in novels just to make her happy. Ethan knew the little things about Sophie that nobody else noticed. He knew she hated thunderstorms, but loved the smell of rain. He knew she always ordered the same coffee, but complained every time it was too sweet. He knew that when she was upset, she didn't want advice. She simply wanted someone to sit beside her. Sophie knew Ethan just as well. She knew he became quiet when he was worried, that he always checked his phone twice before leaving home, and that whenever he was nervous. He rubbed the back of his neck without realizing it. They had become so familiar with each other that sometimes they didn't even need words. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it felt real. They argued over stupid things, laughed until their stomachs hurt, and made plans for a future neither of them doubted. Ethan wanted to build his own design company someday, while Sophie dreamed of becoming a successful writer. They promised to support each other no matter where life took them. On Sophie's birthday, Ethan gave her a small silver bracelet with a tiny heart attached to it. He told her, "Whenever you feel like I'm far away, look at this and remember that I'm still somewhere thinking about you." Sophie smiled and told him she would never take it off. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Then Ethan received an unexpected job opportunity in another city. It was the kind of opportunity he had been waiting for his entire life, and Sophie was the first person he told. She hugged him and encouraged him to take it, even though she knew how difficult the distance would be. They promised to make it work. At first, they did. They called every night, sent each other pictures throughout the day, and counted the days until they could meet again. But as Ethan became busier with work, their conversations became shorter. Sophie started feeling like she was waiting for him more than she was living her own life. One evening, Sophie called Ethan several times, but he didn't answer. Hours later, she finally received a message from him saying he was busy and would call the next day. Sophie tried not to think too much about it. But then, it happened again. And again. Slowly, she began noticing other changes. Ethan stopped telling her about his day. He started keeping his phone face down whenever they talked. Sometimes she could hear another voice in the background, but whenever she asked who it was, he would simply say it was someone from work. Sophie didn't want to become suspicious of the person she loved, so she kept telling herself that she was imagining things. She trusted Ethan. At least, she thought she did. Then, one Friday evening, everything changed. Sophie had planned a surprise visit to Ethan's city. She wanted to spend the weekend with him because their anniversary was only a few days away. She didn't tell him she was coming. She wanted to surprise him the way he had surprised her so many times before. But when Sophie arrived outside his apartment, she saw something she wasn't prepared for. Ethan was standing outside with another woman. The woman was laughing as Ethan carried a suitcase for her. Then, before they walked inside, she hugged him. Sophie froze. She stood across the street holding the small gift she had bought for him. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She wanted to believe there was an explanation. She wanted to cross the street and ask him who the woman was. But then she saw Ethan smile at her in a way Sophie hadn't seen in months. A painful thought entered her mind. Maybe I wasn't imagining anything. She didn't confront him. Instead, she turned around and walked away. That night, Ethan called her. Sophie answered, but she didn't say anything. "Hey," Ethan said. "I'm sorry I couldn't call earlier." Sophie closed her eyes. Who is she? There was silence. Ethan immediately understood what she meant. "Sophie, it's not what you think." She laughed bitterly. "That's what everyone says when it is exactly what it looks like. Please let me explain. I don't want an explanation." "Sophie," she interrupted him. "Just tell me one thing. Do you still love me?" Ethan went silent. That silence destroyed something inside her. Sophie waited for him to say yes. He didn't. Finally, Ethan whispered, "I don't know." Tears rolled down Sophie's face. After everything they had shared, after every promise, after every plan for the future, he couldn't even tell her that he loved her. "Okay," she whispered. "Sophie, wait, no, I'm done waiting." She ended the call. For the rest of the night, she cried until she had no tears left. The next morning, she packed every gift Ethan had ever given her into a box. The photographs went into the same box. The letters, the movie tickets, the little notes he had left in her books, all of them disappeared beneath the lid. Then, she looked at the silver bracelet on her wrist. For a moment, she thought about taking it off. But she couldn't. Instead, she picked up her phone, opened Ethan's contact, and stared at his name one last time. Then, she deleted it. She removed his pictures. She blocked his number. And finally, she whispered, "I'll forget you." But she couldn't delete the memories. Years later, she would realize that this was the moment her heart broke. But it wasn't the moment their story ended, because Ethan had never betrayed her. The woman Sophie had seen that night was hiding a secret of her own. And 5 years later, Sophie would receive a message from a number she had deleted long ago. A message that would force her to question everything she believed about the night she walked away. "I don't know if this number still belongs to you, but I never forgot you." Ethan stared at Sophie's message for several minutes. She had asked him to tell her everything, and for the first time in 5 years, he knew he couldn't hide behind silence anymore. He opened the old box beside him and took out a photograph of Sophie from their final year together. He looked at her smile for a moment before finally typing, "The woman you saw that night was my sister, Emily." Sophie read the message and immediately felt her chest tighten. She had spent 5 years believing she had seen Ethan with another woman, believing that moment had proven he no longer loved her. But now she was discovering that everything she had believed had been wrong. Ethan explained everything. Emily had been going through a serious personal crisis and had suddenly needed somewhere safe to stay. She had arrived at Ethan's apartment that evening with a suitcase, and Ethan had promised to help her without telling anyone until she was ready. He had never expected Sophie to see them together. When Sophie asked him who she was during their final phone call, Ethan had wanted to explain. But at the same time, he had been dealing with another problem. His company had offered him a position overseas, and he was expected to leave within weeks. He knew Sophie had her own dreams and had recently been accepted into a prestigious writing program. Ethan believed that if they stayed together, Sophie would eventually feel pressured to choose between him and her future. So when Sophie confronted him, Ethan panicked. Instead of telling her the truth, he allowed her to believe that something had changed between them. When she asked if he still loved her, he couldn't bring himself to say yes, because he was afraid that if he admitted it, he would never be able to let her go. He thought making her believe he didn't love her would allow her to move forward. It was a decision he had regretted almost every day since. Sophie read his explanation with tears streaming down her face. She thought about all the nights she had cried alone, wondering what she had done wrong. She remembered staring at her phone after their breakup and asking herself why she hadn't been enough. For 5 years, she had carried the belief that Ethan had chosen someone else. Now she realized that both of them had been suffering because neither had been honest. She asked him why he had never contacted her before. Ethan replied that he had tried several times. He had written messages but never sent them. He had almost called her on her birthday every year, but he always stopped himself because he believed she deserved a chance to build a life without him. He had followed her career from a distance and had even read every book she published. He admitted that when he read her stories about people who lost each other, he sometimes wondered if she was secretly writing about him. Sophie smiled sadly when she read that. Then, she confessed something of her own. She told Ethan that she had never really moved on either. She had dated people, built her career, and tried to convince herself that she was happy, but there had always been a part of her heart that belonged to the boy who had spilled coffee on her assignment years ago. Ethan asked if she hated him. Sophie stared at the question. She thought about it carefully before replying, "I wanted to hate you. It would have been easier. But I never could." For the first time during their conversation, Ethan smiled. They continued talking until sunrise. They talked about everything they had missed during those 5 years. Ethan told her about the places he had traveled to, the business he had built, and the mistakes he had made. Sophie told him about her books, the loneliness she had hidden behind her success, and all the little moments that had reminded her of him. But eventually, they reached the question neither of them could avoid. "What happens now?" Sophie asked. Ethan didn't pretend to know. "I don't know," he replied. "But I don't want to lose you again because I'm afraid." A few days later, they agreed to meet. Sophie was nervous as she walked toward the little coffee shop where they had first met. 5 years had passed, but the place looked almost exactly the same. The same windows, the same tables. Even the old sign above the entrance was still there. Then she saw him. Ethan was standing outside. For a moment, neither of them moved. He looked older. She did too. They had both changed in ways the other couldn't have imagined, but when their eyes met, Sophie saw the same person she had loved all those years ago. Ethan smiled. "Hi," Sophie smiled back. "Hi." They walked inside and sat at their old table. Neither of them knew whether they were starting something new or simply reopening an old wound. But they talked honestly this time. No secrets, no pretending, no decisions made on behalf of the other person. Ethan told Sophie that he still loved her. Sophie admitted that she still loved him too. But she also told him that love wasn't enough anymore. "If we're going to try again," she said, "we can't be the people we were 5 years ago." Ethan nodded. "I know. We have to trust each other. I know. And if something scares us, we talk about it. I promise." Sophie smiled. "Don't make promises you can't keep." Ethan laughed softly. "Then I'll make you a different promise." She looked at him. "I won't make decisions for you anymore." Sophie felt tears in her eyes. That was exactly what she had needed to hear 5 years ago. They didn't immediately become a couple again. They took their time. They started as friends, slowly rebuilding the trust they had lost. They met whenever they could, called each other at night, and learned about the people they had become during their years apart. Eventually, love found its way back into their lives. Not the innocent love they had shared when they were younger. Something deeper. Something stronger. Something built on honesty. Months later, Sophie was sitting beside Ethan in a quiet park when she looked at her phone. His number was still saved. She smiled. Ethan noticed. "What?" Sophie turned the phone toward him. His name was on the screen. She had saved it again. This time, she hadn't simply saved his name. She had added a small heart beside it. Ethan laughed. "So you finally saved my number again." Sophie smiled. I deleted it once. I remember. I thought deleting your number would help me forget you. And did it? She looked at him. No, Ethan smiled. What did you learn? Sophie took his hand. That you can delete a number in 1 second. She paused, but you can't delete years of memories. Ethan gently squeezed her hand. And sometimes, he said, you don't need to. Sophie leaned against his shoulder as the sun began to set. 5 years earlier, she had walked away believing she was losing the love of her life. 5 years later, she finally understood that their love had never really disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath fear, silence, and one terrible misunderstanding. They didn't get their lost years back. They couldn't erase the pain they had caused each other. But they could choose what happened next. And this time, they chose each other. Because sometimes the person you delete from your phone is the person your heart never learned how to forget. And sometimes, the memories you spend years trying to erase are the very memories that lead you back home. 5 years had passed since Sophie had walked away from Ethan. 5 years since she had deleted his number, blocked his calls, and convinced herself that she had finally left him in the past. Life had changed in ways she never expected. She had moved to another city, built a successful career as a writer, and learned how to live without the person who had once been part of every moment of her life. From the outside, Sophie seemed completely happy. She had her own apartment, a career she was proud of, good friends, and a life that no longer depended on anyone else. But there were still certain moments when the past quietly returned. Whenever it rained, she remembered the coffee shop where Ethan had first spilled coffee on her assignment. Whenever she passed a bookstore, she remembered the afternoons they had spent choosing books for each other. And whenever she heard their favorite song, she still found herself wondering what Ethan was doing. She hated that part of herself. She had promised herself she would forget him, yet somehow 5 years had passed and she still remembered every little detail. She never told anyone that. Not even her closest friends knew how much Ethan still occupied a small corner of her heart. Whenever someone asked if she had ever been truly in love, Sophie would smile and change the subject. She had dated a few people over the years, but none of those relationships lasted. It wasn't because she was waiting for Ethan. At least, that's what she told herself. She simply hadn't met anyone who made her feel the same way. Meanwhile, Ethan's life had changed too. The job that had taken him away from Sophie had eventually become a successful career. He had built the design company he had always dreamed about and was now living in another state. He had everything he had once wanted: a beautiful apartment, financial stability, a successful business, and the freedom to travel. But there was one thing he had never managed to replace: Sophie. He had tried. He had dated other women. He had gone on vacations, attended parties, and filled his life with work. But whenever someone asked him what had happened to the girl he used to love, he never knew how to answer. He couldn't tell them that he had lost her because he had made the most painful decision of his life to protect her. Because the woman Sophie had seen outside his apartment 5 years earlier had never been his girlfriend. She had been his younger sister, Emily. Emily had been going through a difficult situation at the time and had suddenly needed a place to stay. Ethan had kept it private because Emily had specifically asked him not to tell anyone about what she was dealing with. Ethan had planned to explain everything to Sophie, but before he could, Sophie had seen them together. And then came the phone call. When Sophie asked him if he still loved her, Ethan had said, "I don't know." But that wasn't because he didn't love her. He had said it because he was terrified. At that time, Ethan had just discovered that he had been offered an opportunity to work overseas. The company wanted him to move permanently, and he knew how much Sophie hated long-distance relationships. He also knew she had been offered a place in a writing program in another country. Ethan was afraid that if they tried to stay together, one of them would eventually give up their dream for the other. So when Sophie accused him of betraying her, Ethan had frozen. Instead of fighting for her, he had let her believe the worst. And it was the biggest mistake of his life. For 5 years, Ethan had carried that mistake with him. Then one evening, he found an old box while cleaning his apartment. Inside were photographs, movie tickets, handwritten notes, and a small piece of paper Sophie had once given him. It said, "No matter where life takes us, I hope you always find your way back to me." Ethan sat on the floor holding that note for a long time. He had promised himself that he would never disturb Sophie's life again. If she had finally moved on, he didn't want to destroy her peace just because he still missed her. But that night, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He took out his phone. Sophie's number was no longer saved. He had deleted it years ago. But he still remembered it. After staring at the screen for several minutes, Ethan typed the number from memory. He didn't know whether it was still hers. He didn't know whether she would respond. He didn't even know whether she would want to hear from him. But after 5 years of silence, he finally sent one message. "I don't know if this number still belongs to you, but I never forgot you." Then he placed his phone on the table and walked away. He told himself not to wait for a response, but he checked his phone every few minutes. Nothing. Meanwhile, Sophie was sitting at her desk working on the final chapter of her new novel when her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. She almost ignored it. Then she opened the message. Her eyes stopped on the words. "I don't know if this number still belongs to you, but I never forgot you." Her heart began beating faster. She read it again. And again. She knew that sentence, not because of the words, because of the way they made her feel. Her hands started trembling. She looked at the number. She didn't have it saved anymore. But somehow, deep inside, she already knew who it was. She typed one word. "Ethan?" The reply came almost immediately. Yes, Sophie put her phone down and covered her face with both hands. 5 years. 5 years of trying to forget him. 5 years of telling herself that he had never truly loved her. And now, with one word, every memory she had buried came rushing back. Her first instinct was to block the number. Instead, she typed, "Why are you contacting me now?" Ethan stared at the message for a long time before answering. "Because I spent 5 years regretting the last thing I ever said to you." Sophie felt tears building in her eyes. She knew exactly what he meant. "I don't know." The 3 words that had haunted her for 5 years. She typed, "You said you didn't know if you loved me." Ethan's reply came a few moments later. "I lied." Sophie froze. Another message appeared. "I knew exactly how I felt about you. I was just too afraid to tell you the truth." Sophie stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She wanted answers. She wanted to know why he had let her walk away. She wanted to know who that woman had been. She wanted to know why he had never come after her. Finally, she asked the question that had stayed inside her for 5 years. "Then, why did you let me leave?" This time, Ethan didn't reply immediately. Several minutes passed. Then, her phone vibrated. There was only one sentence. "Because I thought letting you hate me would hurt less than asking you to give up your future for me." Sophie stopped breathing. She read the message again. Then a second message appeared. "And I was wrong." For the first time in 5 years, Sophie realized that maybe the story she had been telling herself wasn't the whole truth. Maybe Ethan hadn't stopped loving her. Maybe he had been struggling too. And maybe the breakup that had destroyed both of them had started with a misunderstanding neither of them had ever been brave enough to explain. Sophie wiped her tears and typed one final message. "Tell me everything." Ethan looked at those 3 words on his screen. He knew that whatever happened next could change both of their lives. So he finally decided to tell her the truth. The truth about that woman. The truth about why he had pushed Sophie away. And the truth about what had happened during the 5 years they spent apart.